Hey guys, it's Wednesday, December 5th, and I'm back in Chattanooga. I appreciate George taking over while I was gone. We're bringing Dean back in. We have some new indices that we want to talk about related to safety and violations. One of the data points, or multiple points of data that we've been acquiring, is related to hours of service and EOD data, and then looking at how the safety data is being impacted by both the implementation of EODs, but also what EODs are telling us about driver behavior and safer environments. One of the things, Dean, we'll bring Dean, one of the things that I remember or saw yesterday you talked about was the fact that in the winter is actually, because drivers are able to get better sleep, they're actually operate safer. And it was sort of surprising to me because I think about the weather, the winter weather, and I always feel like winter is less safe. But you pointed out yesterday because they're able to get better sleep, that they're in better shape.
Yeah, they manage risk a little bit better. I think the miles are harder, so you've got more traction issues, so that accident types are different, but what you don't see is the level of severity. So the frequency actually dips in winter compared to summer, and it's just human physiology. People do more in the summer with daylight hours, and they just burn those hours. They don't sleep as much, so as a result their risk goes up because they're more sleep deprived, less attentive at the wheel, and their cognitive horsepower is just much lower. They don't make better decisions, and that's just a function of humans across the entire spectrum, not just truck drivers, but truck drivers are affected by it because they're so sleep deprived generally, given their sleep schedules are all over the place. So I wanted to...
So Dean, this looks like a really erratic chart, a lot of up and down. What do you have here?
What we're measuring here is the number of drivers that drivers are driving every day on line 3, which is categorized as on-duty driving. So with ELDs, that triggers at 5 miles an hour automatically. With the old ELDs or paper logs, of course, that didn't happen, but with the AOBRDs, there's a trigger where it only happens sort of outside of a mile and above 20 miles an hour. So that's why ELDs are so problematic, because when drivers are looking for a park, anything over 5 miles an hour, it triggers an on-duty status, whereas the older style non-compliant devices, you can actually move around truck stops and find a park. So what we're seeing here is that before the soft mandate on December 18, there was a lot more volatility in the hours drivers were recording, but as soon as the hard mandate came in, drivers...
Soft mandate, you mean?
Soft mandate, yeah, the soft mandate came in here. There was still a number of drivers that had devices but didn't have them turned on. That number was as high as 30% according to some of our people in the industry. But when the hard mandate came in, what you saw was a much tighter range of driving hours recorded each day, and it kind of followed the market volumes and the capacity in the market. So this was a busy period of the year during July. Then things started to quieten off here in early October when we noticed volume started to drop. And of course, if you look at the two Thanksgiving periods here, you can see hours driving fall right away. And then you can, if you look over to the far right now, you can see that it's bumped right back up around 6.8, close to 7. Now, these are hours for all drivers, short haul, long haul, and regional. So
Dean, I see these. So I see this red and this green.
Yep.
It looks like a baseline of 6.5 hours per day. Is that right?
Yeah, that's kind of the average that we've struck for most drivers.
Okay, and so this is this daily utilization in terms of hours
it's the number
of drivers driving?
Yeah.
How do you respond? Drivers tell us when we put out that the average is 6.8 hours or 7.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Right.
They take full advantage of their 11 hours, but the data doesn't say that.
No.
How do you reconcile the two?
So there's a driving skill issue. So a lot of the bigger fleets that have student drivers have lower levels of experience. They find it harder to do more miles in each hour. So it's not a function of speed, which is miles per hour. It's miles in each hour. It's a function of weather this time of the year reduces the number of miles they can drive. It's also a function of congestion and traffic. So there's a lot of states where you actually can't do the miles. So it averages out at about 6.5 to 7. In fact, the average for truckload carriers is about 6.8 hours per day out of a theoretical maximum of 11. So there's a lot of inefficiency in the current rules because they lack flexibility.
So what are the other things so it's great about the EOD data, and I think as EODs are sort of this very polarizing subject, but the great thing about EOD data is by going out and articulating it, we now are able to hold the shippers and people that are holding the drivers, hold them accountable, which we weren't able to do before, right?
Right, correct. Yeah. Every hour on the dock now comes off your 60 hours at the end of the week.
So do you think the shipper behavior is changing or will change?
Anecdotally, yes.
Okay.
As the capacity starts to soften, though, I can see some of the bad habits creeping back in. So they've got to hold their feet to the fire.
So this is a new index that we've just taken in, that we just added. What is this total violations?
This is from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. These are the total violations reported. So there's a little bit of lag in the data because it takes time for each state to report the data into to the FMCSA. But what it's showing you is that each year there's a cyclical nature to violations, and it pivots around a couple of things. There's the major road check that happens in June each year, and then in August there's the brake check. So they have September, I think it is. So if you look at each year, you can see that the total number of violations spike, and they're consistent around the couple of major blitzes that the carriers have.
So this 499,676 number that was over what period of time were the violations?
So these are monthly data sets.
So there were 499,000 violations within that month that's represented.
And we're always showing a period here of about 4 years.
So over the last paint was in that.
But what's interesting, this is pretty misleading though, because when you've got to dig into the states, because that's where the real nuggets are. And if we could dive into the next chart, what we're looking at here is the number of violations per 1,000 miles, and that shows you that some states are very, very different to others. And what we're talking about here on this chart is what we call lane enforcement severity, because some states have different levels of enforcement compared to others. A lot of fleets have told me that they have lots of violations in Texas and Arizona and California, and what I would tell them is when I normalise the number of violations by the number of miles in each state, we get a very different picture. And for example, Maryland is the #1 state for violations. It has 188 violations per 1,000 miles, whereas it's number 39 on the list of lane highway miles. So it's way down the list of total miles in a state, but it's #1 in terms of violations per lane mile.
And Dean, does that mean that the police are just ruthless in Maryland? They're hammering.
If you go into Maryland, the state troopers are going to hammer you. Whereas if you go into states like California, that's about #2 on the violation severity list and about #2 in terms of lane miles. If you look at other states like Arizona, Arizona's #4 on the list of lane mile severity, but it's number 29 in terms of total lane miles. So that you can't.
So certain states have much. So the driver's theory that they're more likely to get cited in a state is absolutely true.
Well, absolutely, and it's caused by things like a driver may have done some horrible things at a scale house. To the bathroom. Like we hear all sorts of anecdotal stories about what goes on there. There's other times where it's the other way around, where some people that run the scales have actually been pretty abusive to drivers. So it's a two-way street, but what happens is people have long memories. And in some states they...
Did they also, as they get violations, the joke is state troopers have quotas to meet, right? Is that also, do you think that plays into it, raising money for the states?
It's a huge part of it. It's a huge part of what sort of federal funding they get back.
Yes, because I remember I lived in Texas, and the police would pull. In Tennessee, they didn't have the level of enforcement they do in Texas.
Yeah. Well, the thing with violations, this time of year it's absolutely critical because about 80% of all your roadside violations are going to be maintenance related, right? So if you think about violations, about 70% of the time you get an inspection, it's clean. About 30% of all inspections you actually get a violation, and about a quarter of those you actually put out of service, which could range from a couple of hours to a couple of days. So what's important to remember is about 80% of your violations are maintenance related, and if you think about most of the ones, about 70% are brakes, tyres and lights. They're the main offenders, and you're 6 times more likely to be put out of service because of brake, tyres and lights. So if you're in a truckload space or a fleet where you've got lots of trailers for every tractor and trailers are sitting around idle for 5 and 6 days at a time, in winter everything degrades much faster. So
Dean, this data is in Sonar, and so you can actually see it on a state-by-state basis.
Yep. So our next iteration will have this on a heat map, so you can see how this data plays out visually on a map of America, so you can actually understand what states where you might want to geofence your mobile comm solutions and warn drivers about the different severity levels in each state.
Great. Well, Dean, this is really interesting stuff, and I think it, as people are trying to figure out what states are creating more violations, but also correlated to the safety data, this is incredibly interesting data. So I look forward to seeing the heat map, the geo map as it's created. Yeah. So I want to bring in Ibrahim as well. Ibrahim is our senior economist. If you have not met Ibrahim, at least have heard, Ibrahim and I do a monthly state of the market update where we talk about the freight economy. Ibrahim is a PhD economist. I am not. I am a trucking guy. So I'm able to talk about what's happening in the trucking market, and Ibrahim is able to articulate it in the economy. The stock market has been just a show. It has been really, really rough lately. And Ibrahim, I'm wondering, are you seeing anything that sort of supports the fact that we're headed into a recession or not?
No, I don't think you can go quite that far. Historically, like the old rule of thumb is that the stock market kind of predicts economic activity by like 6 months in advance. So when you see slowdowns in the stock market, it usually means that investors at least think the economy is going to slow down sometime in the near future. And you're right, the stock market's been absolutely crazy. I mean, it's dropped about 8% since the start of October, and it's down since the start of the year overall.
The trucking stocks have just, that has been a really rough go for anybody in transportation.
No, absolutely. And I think part of it is really just, I think investors are coming to grips with the idea that these tariffs that are in place are going to be there next year, and instead of having like a big tax cut to help absorb some of the impact of tariffs this year, like we did this year, companies are going to start to feel the pain as you go into 2019, and so they're reacting to that. And when you've seen like some of the wild swings, the stock market surged on Monday by 2% during parts of the day, and it was down over 3% yesterday, just going up and down. Almost everything is just related to just news on trade and what trade policy is going to look like.
Well, I had read something that had suggested, I think we had covered it, that the belief that the White House is reporting sort of better outcomes, and as people sort of dug into the data, that there was a lack of confidence that China was going to change their stance, and then we were going to have a resolution. Is that supported by what we're seeing?
Sure, and there was also like a significant lack of details as to like what exactly was going to come out of this deal that took place over the weekend. Really, when you think about sort of trade policy and things of that nature, like that, I think markets are really looking for any kind of sign that some of the tariffs that are in place are just going to go away. And I think for most of this year, I think in the back of most people's minds, the feeling has been that like China and the U.S. will come to some kind of resolution.
So just real quick, we're looking here at the Purchasing Managers Index inside of Sonar. What does this tell us?
So this is survey data on the manufacturing sector. It's done by the Institute of Supply Management, and they survey members of the manufacturing community, and they ask about different aspects of business activity. And so the number that comes out of the ISM index is really just the percentage of people that they survey that say that activity is expanding instead of contracting, right? So historically, numbers above 50 mean that you get expansion in the sector. You get above 55, that's really good expansion in that sector. And you can see all throughout the course of this year, we've been well above 55. We're close to 60 as of the most recent reading, which was released a couple days ago, 59.3. And so this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that I don't think that there's a whole lot of signs that the economy is really slowing down all that much. Again, it's something to keep an eye on because there's a leading aspect to what happens in the stock market versus what happens in the actual economy. But
anything above 50, from what I understand, is an expansion, or at least high confidence. And 59.3 is still, as of the end of November, is a really strong number.
They're very high readings, sure. And earlier this year we saw, multi-year kind of highs coming out of this data. And so, these readings of 59 mean that things are still looking pretty good in the manufacturing sector. This is important for freight because all this manufactured goods translates to freight demand one way or another.
So Ibrahim, if we were to sort of concisely say it, do you believe in the next 6 months that the U.S. economy is heading into a recession?
No. And I've said this a bunch of times in various forums, but I do think the economy is going to start to slow down. Monetary policy takes a little bit of time to take hold in the economy, and the Fed's been raising rates, and these tariffs are going to take some bite out of the economy as well next year. But there's a lot of things that are moving in the right direction for the economy right now. And I think slower but still pretty good is probably the best outlook for the economy right now.
Got it. Well, you have heard it here, right here on FreightWaves Now. Every day at 4 p.m. Eastern, we go through the freight markets and talk about what's on our mind for the next 24 or 72 hours. And I want to thank both Ibrahim and Dean for coming today. Look, tune in tomorrow. We'll have more discussions on the freight market. Thank you.